Christ is born. In today's epistle reading, at the very end of the reading, it used the word, if you were listening closely, it used the word appearing, or appearance of Christ. You know, it said, I think Paul said something like, and like, blessed are all those who love the Lord's wondrous appearing. And that word actually in Greek is theophany, right? So if you were actually to kind of maybe just transliterate it, right, like the way that we do, like the word theotokos, you would have, you know, blessed are all those who love the Lord's theophany. And this gives us a little hint into the feast that's coming up this week. And that is that by theophany, what Paul means there is kind of the whole incarnation of Christ. He means everything from his birth, to his life, to his ministry, everything through his death, all the way up to his leaving. And if you read in other of Paul's letters, and even the book of Revelation, the second coming of Christ is called the second appearing, or the second theophany, right? The second appearance of Christ. And so this gives us a little bit of a clue as to what the Feast of Theophany means, meant historically and theologically. Because originally, the Feast of Theophany was first started shortly after the persecution ended in the 4th century, and it was a general feast commemorating the whole theophany of Christ, right? That God kind of showed up on the scene of earth. And later in history, we separated the feast, right? And we had theophany, and then we separated out and we have Christmas. Because it used to be that you celebrated the birth of Christ together with the baptism and everything else. But it separated out, and that's what created the 12 days of Christmas that we're in the middle of. But there's some places in the Orthodox world that never separated the feast. So if you go to like Georgia or Armenia, they don't have Christmas. They never have. They just have theophany. And actually Christmas and the wise men and everything else is all commemorated together with the baptism on the same day. So that's a little side note I wanted to give you. And that's why this reading is read on this Sunday, is because it mentions this appearing of the Lord before the Feast of Theophany. But I want to focus on a few other things that Paul says in this letter that I think are really, really important advice for someone trying to live the Christian life. He says that you have to be watchful. Right? He says this, that you need to be watchful and to pay attention to what you're doing. And I think that this is sometimes a neglected aspect of the Christian life, that we approach the spiritual life as one that can be done casually, as one that can be done casually, or sort of not with much watchfulness. So when you think of the word watchfulness, what you really want to think is, you can think of like the Greek word is nepsis, and a lot of the fathers talk about like a cat watching a mouse, right? Like this is what watchfulness is, right? You're told, like, very attentive, right? Attentive and watchful, and you're not becoming distracted, right? And this describes what the spiritual life is that in order for us to grow or to progress, right, we need to be watchful. Throughout the letters, what Paul's talking about, and what Jesus talks about, that he tells his disciples, right? This is a great one. He tells his disciples when they're in the Garden of Gethsemane to pray and what? Pray and watch with me, right? And what do they do instead? They fall asleep. That's a great analogy, I think, of the pitfall that we often fall into is instead of being watchful and attentive to our inner life, we fall asleep at the wheel. And we're not there. And the reason that watchfulness is necessary in the spiritual life is because we have the tendency to slip back into old habits. That if we don't fight in our spiritual life, if we don't enter that struggle, we will naturally regress back to undesirable states. It's like that way with anything. If you want to be fit and in shape, what do you have to do? You have to watch what you eat, right? You have to be careful. You have to pay attention. No one got thin by not being watchful, right? By just saying, I'm going to go on a diet, but I'm not going to pay attention to anything I eat. Right? That never happened. And it doesn't happen in the spiritual life either. And I think this is because we're reminded that the spiritual life is very much a struggle. And really all of life is a struggle. And the Greek word that the fathers use there is argon. which is this struggle that you're in. And so we have to kind of come to we have to admit that life is a constant struggle. And we have to come to terms with that, right? Whether it's in our relationships or whether it's in anything that matters, right? Our friendships or spiritual life or acquiring virtue, there's always an element of struggle. There's always an element of work. When Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, right? What was one of the curses that was given to them? That they'd have to toil and work the land, right? And so this is kind of a condition that we live in, is that we live in a world where work and struggle is inescapable. And if we are neglectful, things revert back to their kind of wild, untamed selves. Think if you've ever done gardening before, right? When you garden, what do you have to do? You have to constantly go out there like every few days and what? Weed, right? Pull weeds out. What happens if you just neglect your garden and you don't watch it? The deer come and they eat it, right? Weeds grow up, diseases or bugs spread, and you don't treat them right away, and then they become like an infestation, and you lose your produce that you're trying to grow. And so you see, this isn't just a spiritual thing. This watchfulness really applies to every area of our life. That if we're not watchful, that if we don't approach our lives, and especially our spiritual lives, with intentionality, things fall apart. And it's especially true in our relationships. So many marriages fall apart because people are not watchful, because they're not being attentive to it, because they're kind of taking a casual approach to that most important relationship. Maybe another good analogy for you would be maybe like a mother with small children, right? A mother with really small children has to what? Always be watchful, right? And that's why these mothers always seem like they're tired or they're out of their minds, because they're just constantly attentive to this child's needs all the time, making sure they don't hurt themselves, they're not getting into that cupboard, they're getting enough to eat, they're sleeping. That is, I think, a good analogy of how we need to approach our inner lives. Do you know what I mean by inner lives, by the way? I use this word a lot, like your inner life. Does anyone know what that means? When I say inner life, what do you think of?
Prayer.
Prayer? Sandy, what do you think of when I say inner life? Mary?
Spiritual.
Spiritual things. And break it down because it can be a little bit abstract. When you think of our inner life, we're talking about our thoughts, our mindsets, our attitudes, right? Kind of our disposition, our desires, right? Our virtues and our character, right? The thing that kind of makes us who we are. You know, that part of us that is most important, that really determines the course of our life, and that can't be taken away from us unless we give it away. Right? That's our inner life, right? Kind of the inner man is how Paul would talk about it in his epistles. And this is the aspect of our life that we need to be attentive to, that we need to be watchful of. But we live in a world with lots of distractions, don't we, right? Lots of distractions which turn our attention where? To everything else but our inner life, right? To material things, to our careers, to worrying about, food or clothing, what we'll do on our next day, our schedules, whether or not people like us, whether or not, worries, right? All the worries and anxieties that you deal with every day, I guarantee you have almost nothing to do with your inner life. This is why throughout the Gospels, Jesus is continually saying, peace be with you, and he has this message that covers the whole span of the Gospels, which is one of anti-anxiety. He's saying, don't worry about what you will do tomorrow or what you will eat. What do you say? Even the sparrows, right? It says, even the Lord takes care of the sparrows. Won't he take care of you so much more? If God clothes the lilies of the valley so beautifully, will he not take care of you? I mean, you can go throughout the Gospels and you can find, dozens and dozens of examples of Christ constantly telling people, stop worrying about things that are less important, and to really turn their attention to their inner life. And Paul's doing the same thing in this epistle. He's telling us to be watchful. I think a great example that happened in recent years of not being watchful was the case of Joe Paterno, right? You all remember this, right? Great coach, right? Had amazing legacy, right? pretty much had everything to lose, and he did, right? Right at the end. I mean, his life, the end of his life is a tragedy, the way it ended. Because here's the thing, it's not important how you start. What matters is how you finish. That's the good news of the gospel. And it should be good news to you and I, because what it says is that our past mistakes, our backgrounds, or wherever we started, whatever disadvantages we have, don't have to define us and hold us back. And we're not judged by God by how we started out, but by how we finish our life, which means there's always hope. There's always hope for us. And I think that's very good news. And it also reminds us that just because we've done a lot of great things, we can't just put life in neutral and coast the rest of the way. We can't coast whether it's in our relationships, whether it's in our spiritual life, or in anything else. Because we live in a world where things naturally atrophy. And if we're not watchful, and if we're not constantly tending to those things that matter, they'll fall apart. And that's the warning that Paul is giving to Timothy in this particular epistle. And he gives to us too, is that we need to be watchful. I'll give a little football analogy for Lenny, right? You can have a great first half, right, of football, right? You can be up ahead, but what can happen in the fourth quarter? You can lose a game in the fourth quarter. It happens all the time, right? Because what happens, right? You get the football players, they get a little cocky, right? They get a little self-assured, like we're ahead, right? They get lazy. They take it easy. You know what happens? They're not being watchful. And what happens? The other team comes up and takes it from them. And I think that should be a real risk. That's the fear. When I come out with a child, say, in the fear of God, with faith and love. With the fear of God, that's what the fear of God is, right? The fear of God is the fear that somehow you will, without meaning to, betray God's love and trust. The way that you fear that you will let someone down in an important relationship, right? That you're afraid that you'll somehow not be loyal or not live up to the expectations that you have in a relationship. And that's the fear of God. And the fear of God should be in us on this very point. That what happened to Joe Paterno can happen to us. What can happen to a football team in the fourth quarter can happen to our very lives. And that's not a joke. That's serious. And so we all have to be aware of that danger and be watchful so that all the work we put in our whole life, we don't flush down the drain in the last year of it or whatever moment we're in. So that's both, the gospel is great at this, isn't it? It gives you both a little affliction and a little comfort, right? It gives you a warning, and it also gives you hope. That whatever you had in the past doesn't have to hold you down. You have the whole future ahead of you to become something great in the eyes of God. Glory to Jesus Christ. Glory.